Hey everyone, it's Helen from SMB Deal Hunter. Today we have Chris Williams with us, an acquisition entrepreneur who acquired an outsourced accounting and finance firm, System 6. Chris acquired the firm 3 years ago and has doubled it organically in that time. So very, very excited to hear Chris's story. And Chris, it's great to have you on today.
Awesome, Helen. Good to be here. Thanks for your newsletter. I enjoy reading it, looking at all the different types of businesses that you're featuring. And I know, you and others are doing a lot to shine light on the path that growing a small business can be, good and bad. And so thanks for everything you're doing in the ecosystem. Excited to be here.
Appreciate that. Well, Chris, let's start with your background. Tell us how I know you were kind of in a more traditional banking, private equity, business school route, but yeah, give us
Yeah.
the lowdown on sort of what got you here.
Yeah, absolutely. So relatively traditional path, sort of coming out of college. And, I would say I wasn't one of those kids that was running a lemonade stand at age 5. I wasn't someone who was I'm always going to be an entrepreneur. So I think, to people out there who, some entrepreneurs are like that, right? They've known since day one. To people out there who maybe aren't like that, you can still go down this path, even if you haven't had it since day one. Anyways, in my time in private equity before business school, spent some time working at one of the portfolio companies we owned in sort of an FP&A finance role. And that really piqued my interest to getting away from sort of sitting in board meetings and actually being closer to driving and delivering results. And so I went to business school in 2018 with that as kind of my theme, hey, what could getting into an operating role look like? Private equity operations, going to get a traditional kind of rotational role at a big Fortune 500 company. I'd never heard of search funds or buying a small business. I was lucky enough to go to Stanford for business school, where you learn about that pretty quick because it's a very popular path there. So it kind of came to me. I wasn't necessarily seeking it out, but it really clicked. The idea that, hey, I could get my way into operating through actually acquiring, using my finance skills sort of in that part of the journey. And then now I've got a small business that I can try and grow. In my opinion, for decades, that's the length of the journey I'm trying to be on here. So yeah, was in business school for 2 years, spent most of my time exploring all of the different paths there are out there in buying a small business, traditional search funds, self-funded search, which is what I ended up doing, holdco, buy multiple over the long run. And ultimately, when I graduated, set out with a couple of investors. I didn't raise money. It was kind of COVID. I was able to keep my lights on, but just said, hey, let's go find a business. I'd like you guys to sort of be my mentors and my guides during this process. We'll put together the capital once we find a business. It might be a big business and it'll look like a traditional search fund. It might be smaller and it'll look like self-funded. That's ultimately what we found. System 6 was just under $1 million of earnings when I bought it. And so at that size range, it's very easy to use an SBA loan. And I used an SBA loan, sort of typical 75% SBA, seller debt, cash in the business. And bought, outsourced accounting, finance, back office business 3 years ago. And it's been a wild ride since then, but I'm sure we'll get into all of it. That's the quick background.
No, I'm excited. I have so many questions, but I guess going
Yeah.
back to the search, did you always know that, you're kind of choosing between traditional versus self-funded search? Can you talk a little bit about sort of the pros and cons of,
Yeah,
both
yeah,
approaches?
absolutely. And I think that's really important to hear. What you just said is pros and cons. There are a lot of different ways to go buy a small business. And they've existed before search became popular over the last few years. And I think as an audience member, it's really important, listen to a bunch of different podcasts, read, get a taste of all the different flavors, and then figure out for yourself what's best based on you and your circumstances. I truly believe there is not one best path. So traditional search, you're going to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars out of the gate to keep your lights on for a couple of years to go look for a business to buy. You both because you only own generally up to 25% of the equity in the business once you buy it. That's one of the reasons, but also your investors are going to push you to buy a bigger business, generally 2 million of earnings and above. Part of the reason you want to do that is because you own less of the pie, but part of it is there's a lot of validity that once a business is 2 million of earnings and above, it's just a better business. You've got more dollars to go reinvest and build out a management team. You get to be a CEO faster. So I'd say that's one of the big pros of traditional search is you're going to try and buy something that's bigger. But the con is it's like a lot harder to find that. There's fewer of those businesses out there. Private equity is going to be a more interested buyer at that size range, so it's harder to get those deals done. And some people argue that in traditional search you have less control. You do have investors along the way. You've got a board that has more control over you than in self-funded search. I actually think that's less of an issue than others, but that is a comment out there. Um, and then self-funded search is much more kind of choose your own adventure. Like there's tons of small businesses in sort of the 500,000 to maybe 2 million of earnings range. You can find investors that will back construction businesses, super cyclical, which maybe wouldn't get attention in traditional search, but self-funded search is much more like go find your own thing on your own. And then generally you're going to use an SBA loan to buy the business, which you're going to personally guarantee, which means if it goes bad, you have to pay the loan off personally or go bankrupt. So for some people, that's like a non-starter. And then, the other, I'd say characteristics of self-funded, yep, smaller deal, you get to own a lot more, 70, 80, 90% of the equity versus 25%. Generally, you're going to have more control. If you do have a board, you've got more of a say in the board meeting, so to speak. Again, I think that's more technical than it is in terms of how it plays out in practice. But generally speaking, like traditional search, you got to buy a bigger business, you're going to own less. And there's definitely more constraints over what type of business you can buy. Self-funded search is like generally smaller, you're going to own more, and any type of business you can go buy because it's really your thing. And then if you need investors, you just have to go find the right type of investor. Traditional search is definitely much more of a kind of rubric that they want you to adhere to when you're buying a business.
No, thanks for explaining that. I'm curious, out of your classmates from Stanford, how
Yeah,
many actually went down the business buying path? A lot of people I think go into business school thinking they're going to do one thing,
totally.
they come out doing a
Yeah.
different thing. And how many went down the self-funded path versus the traditional
Yeah.
search?
I mean, it's overall, it's still not a lot. Like when we were in school, the big sessions, the like lunch events would get 100 attendees. Yeah, our class was 450 plus or minus. And I think ultimately 10 to 15 people went down a version of small business acquisitions. So it's a small portion. I think at Stanford, the vast majority of people go down the traditional path. And that's just primarily because that's where kind of most of the attention from the professors and the people that come speak on campus has come from. There's just like fewer examples of people coming out of GSB that have gone down the self-funded path. Like I really knew very little about it, honestly, until after I graduated and started connecting with people from other schools where, it gets a little bit more attention. I think it's changing overall, and the flip side is true at other business schools, where some other business schools, it's like all self-funded. I think it's changing, which is now there's so many different ways to learn about how to buy a small business, these things included, that people are more aware of the different paths, but definitely at Stanford still it's primarily traditional search. And pros and cons, like we said.
No, that's interesting. What did your buy box look like going into this? I guess you were kind of open, but you were going more down the self-funded path.
Yeah, so the way I thought about it was really like self-funded was the path that I was taking in terms of going to buy a business, but I still tried to run my search in a lot of ways like a quote unquote traditional search and use a lot of the same criteria. So I did like mainly direct outreach. I didn't do a ton of broker work in terms of finding my business. System 6 like came from a cold email that I sent to the owner. And then, I was looking for, I would say the same thing that everyone's looking for, a high percentage of repeat consistent revenue in a growing industry. You don't want a bunch of owner Keyman or Keywoman risk, like, decent profit margins, not a ton of like heavy CapEx. Like I was sort of looking for all of those, and I found most, not all, and I would say outsourced accounting back office services where we are. I would say 2 years, like 3 years in, like running a business, to me, it's now very clear the most important criteria are the quality of the industry that you're in. Like rising tide can lift all boats. The inverse is very, very true. Like you're going to change everything in your business when you buy it, but you can't change the industry you're in. And then honestly, like quality of the seller, like it buying from a good person, they can be a hard negotiator, right? Like they can, get an extra 3% on purchase price, but like just buy a business from someone that's fundamentally decent who's not going to try and screw you. And those are, I was fortunate to kind of check the box on both of those. But yeah, look, when I was searching, I was hoping for perfect. You quickly realize that that's not out there. But I do really think quality of the industry, quality of the revenue, which is part of that, is super important because you're going to make so many mistakes, or at least I have, and just like knowing that we're going to get paid next week and knowing that there's more customers out there and there's more demand coming every day, gives me a lot of cushion.
No, that's great advice, and I 100% agreed on that. I'm curious, you bring up quality of industry.
Yeah.
What other industries were you looking at? Did you have like kind of like a short list of industries you pursued, especially since you were doing mostly direct outreach, or how did
Yeah.
you think about
So
this?
my approach on industries was like, look, you got to be pretty broad, like if you pick a super small niche, I think you only get so many shots on goal. But the way I started, I thought about it was first, like, there's got to be a story there for me. Like, that's going to help me resonate with the seller. That's going to help me be more successful day one. So my background had been in finance, like investing, and then within that, like real estate investing. So I only looked at stuff that was either like adjacent or a part of real estate or adjacent and a part of finance. Take like med spas, like that's a very popular thing in search right now, or any sort of medical services, dental roll-ups, whatever. I just like was like, those are good businesses, healthcare services, but I'm not going to look at them because I've just got no experience, no story to tell there. So that was my first filter, honestly, was like, is there a story to tell? And then I just like kind of split my time into real estate related stuff and finance related stuff. Finance related stuff, I didn't get like super niche, but I spent some time looking at, if you just kind of Google like finance service businesses, you can get a list. And before you know it, there's outsourced HR, there's outsourced accounting, there's wealth management, there's services to wealth management. There's a lot of different kind of verticals you can pull out pretty quickly. And then what I did on the real estate side was I like talked to, and I recommend this to people. Like I talked to someone who was a building manager, honestly, that I knew. And I was like, who are all the vendors that you guys spend money with? And like that sprung up a couple niche sort of like real estate property service industries that I looked at. I think anyone who's thinking about industry is a good way to generate ideas is like, go talk to someone that owns a P&L or is a part of a P&L. Like they can be on a finance team at a company and just be like, where do you spend your money? And that you all of a sudden you'll learn of all these different like kind of third-party service providers that are out there.
No, that's really smart and great advice. I'm curious, I guess, when you were doing, how did you structure your outreach? Like, walk us through what
Yeah.
that looked like, because most people, I would say, still are relying a lot on brokers, and not a lot of
Yeah.
people are kind of scared of doing off market or direct outreach. So
Totally. I mean, one, I would say like hindsight 2020, I'm going to make it sound more sophisticated and rosier than it really was. But I mean, it's an outbound sales job. So, it's okay. I'll take outsourced accounting. So, I came up with the idea actually in talking to one of my investors. We've been talking about outsourced HR, and he was like, you should think about outsourced accounting. I use an outsourced accounting business for my family office. So, okay, cool. That's an idea. Go spend like half a day just like Googling it now using ChatGPT just to like answer pretty quickly. Is it a decent industry? Like, you don't need to go write a research paper, but just like, can you build confidence in half a day that you could explain to a 5-year-old why this is a good place to own a company? And then from there, I had access or a subscription to Zoom Info, which I had bought, which is a sales database. And what you do is you go find, mainly through Google, like a couple of companies in the space and go look at their websites and look at like, especially in the about section, like what are the keywords that show up when these companies talk about themselves? And like in our space, outsourced bookkeeping was like a service that a lot of these companies provide. So then you go, for me, I went into Zoom Info and like, keywords, outsourced bookkeeping, employees under 100, above 10, and that's a list of companies. And then, and this is, 5 years ago, like Zoom Info at the time had okay email quality in terms of like actually giving you the contact of the owner. So I had people on Upwork internationally that I would send the list of companies to, and they would send back, these are the owners based off LinkedIn, and these are their emails, and then from there, I had a template. I was using reply.io, which is like an email automation product. I would say I was relatively low volume, pretty high touch customization on the emails, but like, hey, hey, Jeremy, my name's Chris. I'm looking to buy a business in the outsourced accounting industry. Here's why. Like, I noticed this about System 6. Are you interested in talking to me about potentially selling? Like, get in, get out, relatively quick email, show that it's personal, not, from a machine. And yeah, you gotta like send a lot of emails. I mean, I was lower volume, like I said. I think I was trying to do like 50 a week. I had friends who did thousands a week, and that was obviously much more automated, much more kind of spray and pray. But yeah, it's a very different motion, and if you don't have a ton of time, it is harder to do. But I will say, like, it was really nice getting to build a relationship with a guy first, for months before we really even did a deal, and just that created a lot of trust that was helpful in the deal for me.
I'm eager to learn more about that piece. I guess, starting with the 50 a week that you were sort of
Yeah.
emails that you were sending out. So number one, did you rely primarily on cold email for your outreach?
Yeah. I wasn't doing a lot of cold calling. I think, I mean, that might be more interesting now because I think direct outreach seems to have gone up a lot. Like, I get a lot of emails from searchers now, and it's like pretty clear if they had spent, that it must be automatic, because if they went on my LinkedIn, they would tell that like we're probably not for sale. So yeah, I did primarily direct outreach just via email. I have heard stories of like in a super small niche, someone doing like handwritten notes, or nowadays you can like get a robot to write a bunch of notes and mail them for you. But most people, I think, at least when I was doing it, it was still mainly email outreach.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. What were some benchmarks you were trying to shoot for? Like, out of the 50 a week, how many conversations were you able to actually have with sellers?
So the rough rule of thumb that like I was trying to get to was a 20 to 30% reply rate. But that's on a campaign. So that's like the first email is single digit reply rate, but you need to send follow-ups, 2, 3, or 4. And this is like tactical, like, don't send a follow-up on a Sunday. If you set it to follow up 3 days later, like, unless you want to be the guy that's emailing on a Sunday, which some people do. But generally it was, you're trying to get like 20 to 30% reply rate. And I think of that, maybe hoping half of those would like get on the phone. And then, so, you're sending out 50, maybe you're getting 4, 5, 6 conversations out of that. And then maybe 1 or 2 of those are real. Like, it's definitely a tough road to hoe. Which is why, like, a lot of people still find a ton of success in broker deals, because, they're real sellers. Just for me, I had a hard time feeling like I could build the trust quickly enough, with that seller. But I don't, this was my experience. Like, again, most people do brokers, especially in self-funded, because you don't have as much time, and it generally works. So, mine's just a different path.
No, and I think a lot of people wanna go the direct outreach path, but just don't, know
It's
where to
doable. Yeah, I
start.
mean,
So this
it's
is really
doable.
helpful.
It's like, and again, in traditional search, it's what most people are doing. And it's like, you got to build a system, like, take time, pay these software subscriptions. You got to figure out how to warm up your email, and like, don't get it flagged by Google. There's like DMARC or something that you have to do. Like, you probably know this stuff from Deal Hunter, but yeah, there's some like real tactical stuff to get your outbound motion working, but it does work. Most of my friends who bought businesses that I can think of who did traditional, sent them an email.
That's super interesting. And how did you engage the seller in these conversations? Like, how did you kind of approach them once, you know, they did express interest over email? How did you
Yeah,
kind of develop that relationship with them? What did that look like?
I think you got to be careful not to like waste too much time, but you also don't want to just like, get on the first call and say, hey, what's your revenue? What's your EBITDA?
Yeah.
Like, but yeah, get on a call. I mean, look, they're only responding to that email if there's some thread of interest. Um, get on the call and say, hey, look, I'm really glad we're on the phone together. Like, this is what I've seen about System 6 online. Like, could you just tell me more about the business? Tell me about the founding story. And people love to talk about their business. That takes some of the ice and the awkwardness out of the conversation. And then, the goal in the first conversation for me was generally to figure out, hey, like, is this the business I thought it was? Like, is it actually in the industry that I think it's in? Um, and so you can just kind of understand that through the conversation and then get a rough sense of size. Like, I would, depending on how the seller is going, you can sort of try in the end be like, hey, one thing that's important to us is size. Like, we're generally looking for businesses in the $5 to $10 million revenue range. Like, are you guys in that range? Or if they're more close, you might say, hey, how many employees do you guys have? And you can generally like back into rough revenue from that. Um, and then I think in that first call, it's certainly like, um, too early to talk, in my opinion, probably a little too early to talk valuation, but just, say, hey, look, I am still really interested. I'd like to have another call to like talk more, just general numbers and some more general performance of the business, like, so I can help understand if we might be interested in potentially pursuing an offer. And then maybe second call is like you try and get some rough numbers. And then in that second call, be like, hey, based off what I'm hearing, I think we might pay X million dollars, and you want to kind of not lowball, but like obviously don't stretch, but you're just trying to understand, like, does this person want 15 times earnings in an industry that trades for 5? Like, you just got to understand if you're in the ballpark or not.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think like 2 calls, is kind of like enough to understand, hey, is there potentially a deal here?
When you spoke to these sellers who, did actually get on a call, where did you find that it was the greatest sort of misalignment was it in that, they just weren't the right size, or is it that they just had these crazy sort of valuation expectations?
Um,
Or were most pretty reasonable, I guess.
no, I think I didn't run into a ton of crazy valuation expectations. Um, I ran into more, hey, business is smaller than I realized, or often like, especially in the industry like that I spent the most time in, which was this, like, a lot of businesses are newer, and so sellers were not really looking to sell and move on. They were like, I'm looking for capital to help grow, or maybe a partner. And so just like not the right type of deal. I think that was, um, especially when I was searching, it was like 2020, 2021. I think everyone had dollar signs and was like, oh, if I can like raise some more money or get some more money, now it's like, yeah, I'll take this call. And so it was more, yeah, finding people who actually kind of wanted to be selling and getting out of the business, as opposed to, hey, I want to keep running it, but I'm kind of trying to bring on an investor.
But we see that a lot too, so that makes a lot of sense. What did it look like next for you? I mean, what was your pipeline like? How many deals were you seriously sort of pursuing
Yeah,
beyond the like initial 2 calls? What
I was not, it's really hard to do, and I didn't do a good job of it. It's like when you're working on a deal seriously, you want to keep other ones alive so that you don't like feel like the one you have is like the only one.
so tough though.
Yeah, it's super tough. I mean, so like System 6, candidly, like, if it had fallen apart, I would have been back to square one, which I definitely felt that during the deal process. I looked seriously at I would say probably like, yeah, so I searched for a year. I submitted probably 5 or 6 LOIs and looked seriously at like 2 or 3 businesses, or 2 or 3 of those got like serious negotiations. This was the only LOI we signed, but I looked at really seriously a specialty plumbing service business here in the Bay Area where I live. Um, I would have been commuting 2 hours each way. So I probably would not have done that. And I'm glad we didn't do that deal. I probably would have like moved down there during the week and, done the sort of Monday through Thursday thing. And then I looked pretty seriously at a wealth management business, RIA, which is super popular but expensive. And then yeah, System 6. So I'd say 3 super serious deals.
Got it. No, that's interesting, and they're all very different. So,
Yeah,
you
all
could have
very
owned a
different.
plumbing business.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, now we serve a lot of plumbing businesses, so I feel like I'm still in the ecosystem, but I also think like um I probably would have been a worse operator in that ecosystem. Like I appreciate owning a finance business where like I do think there's more carryover from my background. I can speak the language better with customers and internally. Um, doesn't mean, you can't learn a new industry, but if you can be in one where you've got some carryover, pretty useful.
No, I definitely can see that with the deals you did, I guess, submit LOIs for, or I guess this was
Yep.
the only one you kind of had a signed LOI for.
Yep.
What did diligence look like, right after that? Obviously, it was off market, so you
Yeah.
probably didn't have like a ton of materials prepared. So what did you start asking for? How did you run that process?
Yeah. And it's interesting, one of the LOIs that I didn't win, the plumbing business, part of the feedback they got was like, I asked too many questions up front. They were like, you were asking so many questions before the LOI. They were good questions, but we felt like you weren't going to have certainty and you weren't going to move forward and close the deal. So that was an interesting lesson. Um, for System 6, diligence was, I mean, candidly, not incredibly complicated because it's a relatively simple business. We pre-diligence, so the way, and I think this is part of the benefits of like a proprietary direct outreach deal, you can kind of craft the process more. The seller was more like, I don't want to sign an LOI until we know this is super real. Because once I sign an LOI, like he wanted to tell some people on his team and actually, which I loved, and he knew he was going to start doing legal work. And he was like, he'd been burned before or been down the road in the past with like selling to a bigger accounting firm. So he was just like, if we're going to do this, I want to do this. So I got most of my information actually before LOI, and then it was kind of more confirmatory post. But for us, the biggest stuff we were looking at was, or for me, like, at the end of the day, like, who are the customers? How long have they been there? What's their retention look like? Do they seem to grow? Do they seem to get smaller over time? I think customer retention is like one of the most important things in a business because it's really indication in a service business. Like, there's no other way for me to really see the quality of the work that we're doing other than do the customers stick around or not. So that was probably the biggest piece of diligence, and I sliced and diced that a bunch of different ways. We also, System 6 has employees in the time in like 15 states. So there was some like confirmatory HR and legal diligence we had to do to make sure we were generally in compliance with tax laws in places. And then a big thing was I got to meet, again, part of kind of crafting your own deal when you do it direct. The seller was open to this and it was very important to me, like meet the management team or the team, that was sort of part management underneath the seller. And I actually met them before the LOI and he gave them, hey, like kind of a green light, like, do you want to work for this guy? Like, and if you don't want to work for him, I won't sell to him. So that was very unique to be able to get to meet the team before even signing an LOI, and it sort of created a smoother landing into the business. So that became a part of diligence as well. It's just like getting to know them and seeing if there was a fit.
No, it's super rare. It's fantastic that you were able
Yeah,
to get
yeah,
meet the
yeah.
team
Like it,
pre-LOI. I mean, I feel like even post-LOI, a lot of sellers are wary. So
yeah, and I know that's
pretty
rare, but I also think that like, um, yeah, look, part of the benefit of doing direct outreach is you can ask for more of this stuff, and you may not get all of it. I got lucky to get a lot of it, but you can ask, and again, doesn't mean you can't do a good deal without it, but hey, if you can get some of this stuff, ask for it.
No, that's really fair. Are there a lot of folks I'm sure who are going to be listening to this are interested in, acquiring an accounting firm like you
Yeah,
have.
it's hot right now.
Yeah. Are there any specific sort of maybe accounting firm specific diligence questions or things you would want to dig into? If you
Yeah,
were, and now that you're already running one, if you were to buy
totally.
your next one, I'm sure you
Yeah,
have way more insight now
yeah,
too.
and we look at acquisitions. I've tried to stay pretty disciplined on like only do add-ons if we feel like they're really good fits, but have looked at a lot more accounting firms in the last 3 years than I did during search. Um, I think the most important thing with accounting firms right now is it's like figuring out how far along the firm is on the modernization journey. And I think that like there are so many firms out there, $1.5 million worth of revenue, where it's like, look, you can go buy it for very cheap, but which is why a lot of people are attracted to accounting firms, 1 times revenue, 3 times earnings, something like that. But like if you buy a firm, in my opinion, that's like running the 1990s, it doesn't really matter, in my opinion, kind of no matter how little you pay for it, like, man, that's just a lot of modernization. That's a lot of um, work that you have to do to get new systems in place, to get employees to operate in the cloud. And then the customers might not even want to come along with that journey, and they may not want to work in sort of a more modern firm. And then all of a sudden, you're kind of left with not that much after you've bought it and done all this work. So for me, the things that are super important to look for as part of figuring out, hey, if they're modern, what's the tech stack? Like, are they using any cloud software? Are they using any on-premise software, or is it all on-premise? Um, what's their billing model? Is it all hourly, or is there some fixed fee kind of recurring? That's a big sign that a firm is thinking a little bit more modern. What's their average billing per customer? Again, like modern firms are recognizing there's more pricing power in the industry right now and should push prices a little bit. Like if they're doing a bunch of individual tax returns for $500 a year, that's like probably not where you want to go. Also, if it's a tax firm, the mix of like individual tax returns versus business tax returns, individual tax returns are just less desirable. They're more price sensitive. It's easier for somebody to go to TurboTax. Um, so those are some of the, kind of accounting firm specific things to think through. Like I also am pretty quick. Like I want to know the EBITDA margin, profit margin. I want to know revenue retention, customer concentration. Like those are all kind of more typical, just finance things you want to look at. But within
What
account,
are the profit margins you wanna see, I guess, with accounting firms?
yeah, I mean, anything above like I would say high teen, like 18+%, I'm start to be like, okay, like they're operating well, or they've got some pricing, they're priced well. Like a lot of good accounting firms run, kind of 20 to 25%. I think you see some where they're marketing themselves as 30, 35%. And generally speaking, that's like that probably means the owner is doing more work than you realize. And that I don't think that firms that are growing and trying to get some scale should exist at 30, 35% margins. Like, unfortunately, we're not an industry with like a ton of proprietary technology where we could like command that much sort of pricing power that would get you that level of margin. So yeah, in my opinion, like kind of high teens, 20, 25%, that's good. And if it's below that, then that means you're either not that efficient or you're underpriced. And if it's above that, like System 6, when I bought it, was well into the 30s, but I expected it to come down, and it certainly has. Because we just knew we were going to have to build out more of a management team.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's super helpful for people to just actually
Yeah, totally.
hear
Yeah, I
that
mean,
from.
the stuff I want to see is like I want to see a firm that's growing, I don't know, like high single digits, 10+%. Like we're in an industry that's growing right now, so you should be growing too. And yeah, those sort of profit margins in the high teens into the 20s.
Just like how about like the org chart and owner's role? I think a lot of people find accounting firms it's run by three partners that do everything.
Yeah.
How do you think of that in terms of just how the business is structured?
Yeah, I mean, candidly, like I think, and that's maybe a little bit where I get hung up. Like yeah, a little scary to me. There's like a lot of key man risk in accounting firms. Um, I think more so than, in other industries, right? Like especially at scale, like a $5 million accounting firm is probably going to have more key man or key woman, like partners doing work risk than like a $5 million plumbing business where most of the people doing the work are the, the techs below the owner. Um, so yeah, and generally speaking, like multiple partners gets harder to deal with because unless they're all exactly aligned in how they want to sell and how they want to transition, you're going to have a lot of fighting in negotiations, which just gets hard. Um, if it's a firm with one partner who's selling and yeah, they're still doing a lot of the work, I think you need to either feel like there's a good number two there that they can transition the work to, or be open to have them sticking around longer than a year in case you can't go find a number two pretty quickly. But especially in tax, like you need a tax leader who's going to make the tough tax return judgment calls. And if there's not a number two and you don't have tax experience, I think candidly, like you need to look for a firm where the owner is probably going to stick around for a little bit. I wouldn't want to bet on I'm going to go find the perfect replacement within 6 to 9 months because it takes time. It's hard to hire that type of leader in tax right now.
That's really helpful to understand that. And what is that's interesting. What about with sort of customer retention? Do you find that, once you acquire an accounting firm, that's hard to retain customers when you transfer sort of?
Yeah, I think like there's definitely some risk, especially, yeah, do these customers think they're working with a firm or they're just working with Joe who's selling and going to be gone in 9 months? So you do need to figure out, yeah, like, look, if it's a small firm and the owner's still doing a lot of the work and signing every single tax return and meeting with every single customer, like my opinion, you might not want to go buy that. Like you want to buy something where ideally there's some customers that have relationships with people beyond the owner. But I will say, like, I think it's stickier than you think. And I think if again, this comes back to like maybe buying from a good seller. Like if you have a seller who's like going to message to the customers, hey, I've sold, it's in good hands. This is going to be your point of contact going forward. I'm around for the next year. Like people are not going to flock, I think, super aggressively. But if you buy a firm where it's like the owner is like super tight advisor, I think even in that case, again, if the owner is like gonna put their word out there and say, look, you're in good hands with this new person and these new hires, you'll be okay. You just got to be careful where like if the owner wants to go, try and spin up something new, there is definitely some risk that your customers will follow them. But I think it's stickier than you think, as long as you've got an owner that's going to be messaging well to the customers that they should stick around and they're in good hands. And you also have to incentivize the owner, like with a seller note. I had a conversation with a deal 2 weeks ago, sold by a reputable broker, and they're like, we're only considering offers with 100% cash down today and no seller note. And I was like, well, then we're out.
Yeah.
So you do need to protect yourself.
Yeah, speaking of a seller note, how did you guys structure your deal? You mentioned you went SBA. I think you said 75%
Yeah.
SBA. How did you structure the rest of the deal and with your investors as well eventually?
Yeah, so we did a 75% SBA, and then I did a seller note actually on standby, which means basically I don't have to pay interest. It compounds if I'm not paying it, but I don't have to pay interest on it now. And so that way the SBA or Live Oak, who is my lender, looked at it more like almost like equity, and then that helps with the leverage ratios. Basically we were paying a larger multiple. It was 2021, like kind of in the a little bit north of 5 times. Expensive. Our business is a little bit different, like fast growing, high margin. But I sort of said to the seller, like, hey, if this is what you want, your seller note's got to look like this. And this just kind of like, because otherwise the math wouldn't have worked. So that's kind of what we did with the seller note. And that's how I got him to agree to full standby. I was like, look, you want to work with us, you want to sell to me, like you believe in the business, your seller note needs to look like this. And then I did my equity, like pretty normal self-funded equity. So we raised about 10% of the purchase price. I actually put some of my own money into that, so I sort of sit in two buckets, but pretty typical that 10% of investor capital, let's say, earns an 8% preferred return. Again, which right now we're not paying out. We're just putting our excess cash flow onto the balance sheet. We could be paying down that return, but I can make 5% in the savings market right now. Sure, my investors are making 8%, but I'd rather sit on that cash to go do M&A or something. So that equity makes 8% return, and then it converts to 20% of common equity, at a point of liquidity. So yeah, you would say my investors make an 8% return, and then they own 20% of the business, and then I kind of and the rest, plus or minus. So that's like relatively typical, I think, for an SBA deal. 75% leverage, seller note, 10% investor capital, and then that converts to usually somewhere between 15 and 20% investor ownership.
Are your investors looking for, distributions at some point? Are they comfortable with you kind of holding this and maybe
No,
selling
yeah,
it?
so no, and that investor selection is important. So I was working with, these are the investors I worked with during my search, and it was, hey, we're going to go buy a business, and we're going to, try and build a much bigger business over a long run together. And they invest in search funds, mainly traditional, all the time, so they are used to the idea of like, it's actually been interesting. Like, I'm more worried about my EBITDA profit margins than they are. They're more worried about like, hey, is this business going to be 5 times as big 5 years from now? I don't care if your margin this year is 15% or 20% or 22%. Like, don't burn the ship down, and don't, make investments that you can't unwind. But it's been interesting to hear their focus is more like, are we doing the right stuff to be a much bigger business one day, than just like, optimizing for profit margin this year for distribution. So no, they're much more in like, hey, let's go build a big business together, and we'll be your advisors. There's obviously plenty of investors like that. There's obviously doctors and lawyers who want distributions. You can probably get better terms maybe on the equity side if you go more the passive distribution investor route. But I was very convinced in like, look, I've never run a business before. I want professional, small business oriented, growth minded investors around me. And if that means I have to pay them a little bit more, so to speak, I'll do that all day. So that was kind of how I thought about it.
That makes sense. And has that sort of panned out? Do you meet with them regularly? How does that, how have
Yeah,
you been
so
leveraging your investors and their
yeah, I
experience?
mean, we've got a quarterly board meeting, which I find very useful. One, because we talk about meaty topics, and two, because it like forces me, it'll be this Sunday to like, our board meeting's next Friday, but like the weekend before, I'm always like building the board deck, because you don't have time to do that during the week when you run a small business. And that's like actually a super productive time, because it makes me like step back, look at some numbers that I don't look at as frequently, and just think. And then, yeah, I find it very useful in those board meetings to just kind of get like inside a business, you always feel like you're not doing well enough. And they give me a good gut check on like where we are doing well, and then also where we're not. And I think that's helpful to hear, because, you're in this for the long run. And if you always feel like you're not doing well enough, that's going to burn you out at some point. So that's productive. They help me stay disciplined. I certainly feel a lot of pressure right now to be doing M&A, and everyone's doing it. And they have been helping me stay disciplined on like, yes, but you've got a good business that's growing. Don't distract yourself by doing a bad deal. And then also, like, when I have issues going on, I feel like at least once a month, I'm calling one of them to talk through something. Like right now we're going through, some team stuff, and like, they've been a good sounding board. So, I cannot imagine doing this like without people I could talk to. Could you put that together without having investors? Like, probably. You could probably find some people that are really just in your court and willing to support you, but I like the structure of it.
They're more invested.
Yeah, exactly. And like, I mean, for them, it's small dollars. It's like they're much richer than,
Yeah.
than whatever the outcome of this business is. But they're people who have chosen to spend the later half of their career investing in young searchers and sitting on their boards. So they want to be doing it.
Well, I'm glad to hear you had a good experience there. I'm curious, I guess, just, going into the growth you have had, you mentioned you guys doubled organically since you acquired the business. What would you say were some of the key drivers there?
Yeah, I think and give me 1 second here. Honestly, what it is, so we haven't cracked the, I would say, like outbound sales kind of like, B2B service sales motion, like Google Ads. We tried that, didn't really work. But what has really worked is like finding a vertical that you have traction in, and then like pounding that vertical, for lack of a better word, and just trying to be top of mind for people in that industry that you're trying to serve. So for us, honestly, like most of our growth now comes from the acquisition ecosystem. And so I think kind of in the first year, I realized, hey, that could be a good place for us to be selling our services, because I've been through this journey. Most people, when they buy a small business, inherit a mess of a finance department, if there is one. Often it's the owner's spouse doing the financials. And so there's an acute need for what we do in an ecosystem that I'm already in by like my journey. So let's see if we can get some traction. And so it's just been like going to conferences, trying to be active on Twitter and LinkedIn, advertising on podcasts, trying to be on industry podcasts, and just get our brand and name out there. And then obviously we have to do like best in class work alongside that to get the referral motion continuing to work. But that's been the biggest key to our success, was like finding a vertical where you can deliver good services and have a story that resonates with the buyers of your service, and then just like attack that vertical every way that you can. Go to as many conferences, be on every podcast in that industry. And so that's what's worked for us. And now we're looking at like other industries we could do that in. So search, small business buying has been one. We have a lot of HVAC clients through search. So now we're thinking about like going to just industry events in HVAC. We sponsored an HVAC podcast. So for now, our approach has generally been, kind of networking in the modern era, which means conference boots on the ground and digital stuff like this. But it's been a big part of our growth. And then the other thing I would say is adding additional services. So we've doubled revenue. We've also doubled the average size of customers that we're bringing on. And a lot of that is because we're now more proactively trying to serve and selling, like, hey, we'll do your payroll and we'll do your bill pay, more sophisticated financial reporting. So we've definitely just tried to sell bigger packages.
That makes sense. And what is your role looking like these days?
It's growing and evolving. So, when I bought the business, I had somebody in part-time HR and somebody in part-time internal operations. And then I was sort of managing the managers and doing sales. The first year and a half, that kind of continued. And then last year I hired a head of sales. So I'm not talking to prospects anymore or really involved in sales at all. I'm doing more of a biz dev role to try and keep the top of the funnel full. And then this year we promoted somebody internally to be head of accounting delivery, which means managing the managers. So I've kind of stepped out of that. And then we also promoted somebody to be sort of our head of process and what apps are we using, what workflows are we adhering to. So I'd say we're still like candidly early in getting all of that sort of now full management team to work. We also have that part-time head of HR is now full-time in HR. So I'm spending probably, half my time, I would say, working with the management team, and we just started to implement EOS. So half of my time getting the management team to work well, I would say, so to speak. Probably about a quarter of my time on M&A. Like, we are looking at deals. I'm not sourcing yet, but have a decent volume coming in. And then the rest is still like jumping into stuff that goes wrong and helping problem solve. And then like business development, which is going to conferences and stuff like that. That's where my role is right now, managing the management team. Biz dev, both for clients. And then also I go to accounting conferences to like build relationships with firms that, one day we might want to buy. And then problem solving, when it needs to happen.
No, that's super interesting to hear how your role has evolved, and it's great to hear that you're hiring both internally and externally.
Yeah.
It's very
Yeah. I
exciting.
mean, you got to be willing to like, and that's like depending on what you want to do, but if you want to grow your business, look, one very valid path is like buy a business for a low multiple and cash flow it, and in 3 or 4 years you're going to be putting home a lot of money in your pocket. I went more the other way, like pay more. And so our story needs to be one of growth. And so just then be ready to spend money. Like, we hired a salesperson. There's a salary there. We have, like a lot more salary costs in G&A because we've built out a management team that candidly is like probably bigger than it should be for 4.5, for 5 million in revenue, but 4.5, 5 million, but like it's the team that's going to get us from now to 8 or something organically. So you got to make sure you have the ability to cut your margin if you want to try to grow.
Yeah, I completely agree. Chris, I know we're a little bit past time.
That's okay. We can
This
rock.
is really
Yeah, I've got time.
flown. No, this has really flown by. I guess final question from me is I
Yeah,
always
and I've got
ask
a couple
this.
extra minutes too if you want to keep going. So all good.
All right, cool. Yeah, no, I guess then before even going into the final question, I'd love to hear. A lot of people are thinking about going through the SBA process. What has
Yep.
been your experience with the SBA loan? What did that look like for you, I guess, in terms of timing?
Yeah. I
All
think that like the most important thing is like set expectations with your seller and don't overpromise. Like the bank's going to tell you this is the timeline, and sure, that's achievable. Like if everything goes smoothly, but that just like doesn't happen that much. And so, if you tell the seller, all right, like, oh, I signed, we're gonna be closing 90 days, like no matter what, it just like that's probably not gonna happen. And then you're gonna have to go to the seller with your tail between your legs, and that's gonna make them mad. And now you've got some bad blood. Um, so I think it's, hey, this is what the timeline can look like, but then also warn them like this takes a long time. Sometimes stuff gets awry, like it is what it is, this is how we're gonna get our deal done. And then kind of use the SBA as the bad guy. Like, hey, this is getting delayed. Like the SBA is, this is taking forever. So that's kind of some advice. For us, I would say the only like hiccups that came through our SBA process, Live Oak did a great job of like pretty quickly once we signed the LOI, you go into underwriting, and then they, you know, issue you a letter that says, hey, we can lend at this amount, and hopefully it's the amount that you expected. And then you have to go get a valuation. And so again, because we were paying a higher multiple because of some aspects of our business, like there was a chance that the valuation would come in differently, and that would create some challenges. I was upfront with the seller about that and like said, hey, we got to go get this valuation now. Like depending where it comes back, like that may create some changes in our, timeline or structure. And then depending on like, we also ran into some challenges at the end with third-party counsel who's reviewing the deal on behalf of Live Oak because, I had an operating agreement with my investors, and and it looked like a typical board structure in a lot of ways, and they were kind of starting to feel like, hey, this feels like more of a private equity deal, less of like a individual buyer SBA deal. And so we just had to get that counsel comfortable, and that created some delays. So depending on what type of investor structure you might be putting in, that might add some timeline. So again, I think it's just like, look, the SBA is a beautiful thing. It's literally like doing its job, facilitating the transition of small businesses that otherwise no one would really be able to buy because banks can't lend traditionally on something this small. So like it's a very awesome program. Sure, it takes a long time. Just make sure you set expectations around it.
And how did you get comfortable around the personal guarantee, the PG?
One, like it's really hard to wrap your head around. So I got comfortable with just like talking to a lot of other people that had been in my shoes, and we're like, yeah, like you just realize a lot more people are out there with a PG. It's very common in real estate, entrepreneurial real estate. Like there's a lot more people out there carrying this than you think. And it's not crazy. It's risky, but it's not crazy. And then the second thing is honestly, like if you're not, I told myself before we signed the LOI, I was like, and this was probably the most important thing I had to hold myself to, which was like, if you do not feel more comfortable about the PG after diligence than you do now, walk away. So like diligence needs to make you feel better about your ability to make payments and um, not go into bankruptcy. And if diligence makes you feel worse, then you got to walk away. Like if you're nervous about the PG after having done deep diligence on the company, I really don't think you should do the deal, or you should restructure it and use less leverage. And so for me, I saw, hey, profit, revenue's grown in this company every month the last 5 years. And, this is how much revenue we'd have to lose. It was like 40 or 50% before I'd have any issue paying my debt. That made me feel very comfortable. If those numbers had looked differently, I would have walked.
That makes a lot of sense. I guess final question for me is just any final words of wisdom for first-time buyers out there who be listening to this.
Yeah, I think I alluded to earlier. I think I feel very strongly about this. Well, I'll give two pieces of wisdom, I guess. One, there are a lot of different ways to go buy a small business. Go learn about all of them. It's way easier to learn about all of them than it used to be. Listen to podcasts, read websites, have a conversation with ChatGPT. I don't know how good it is at that, but like learn about all the different paths. There is no right path. There's some people on Twitter and other places who scream about, traditional is the only way, or self-funded is the only way, or you're all stupid. Like you should never do this. Like, don't listen to those people. Take in a bunch of information and decide for yourself what's best for you. Do you want to buy a bigger business or not? Are you comfortable with the PG or not? Do you have geographic restrictions? Like all important questions you got to ask yourself. And then I think the second thing is like, just, if I only had to pick one thing, it's buy a business in a good industry. And that means industry with some growth in it and where there's consistent revenue. It's just, you don't want to be somewhere where something completely outside of your control, i.e. a change in the industry or a change in the economy, and you have really cyclical project-based revenue, means you're going to like have to go into bankruptcy. Like the only stories I know, I think of people who were like rational on the way in and have had something like that happen, like, be staring down the barrel of bankruptcy. It's like something changed in the industry. Or it was a cyclical industry and they just timed it wrong. And so that's just like the one bet you got to get right.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. Chris, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah.
If people want to, reach out, whether it's about System 6, whether it's about, I guess, working with you guys as clients or just in general about the search process, how should they reach out to you?
Absolutely. Yeah. You can, find me on Twitter. I'm like CTW_SMB, or just email me. It's Chris@System6SIX. So like fully spelled out.com. Search has changed my life, candidly. Like I'm running and trying to grow a small business. Some days for the better, some days, like it's okay to be like, man, it might be nice to have this sort of cushy W-2 life again. But I say a lot of that in jest. Like search is a really, really interesting path for the long run. And so I'm happy to help people think through it. I don't think you should just completely like YOLO your way into it. Like you got to, have some real thought and know that it's going to come with some stress. But I'm happy to help people think through that. And then of course, we serve small businesses and take, your day-to-day finance needs off of your plate if you're an owner or someone inside the business. So, if anyone needs help with their finance operations, bookkeeping, et cetera, we're happy to have a conversation as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. I'm sure a lot of people will be reaching out. So thank you again for your time today. And
yeah,
please keep in touch.
Thank you, Helen, for everything you're doing. Awesome conversation.